Don't sign that will. A black boy saves a billionaire from a family betrayal. Jamal had always been a survivor. Born into a world that had little mercy for boys like him, he learned early that life was a game of power, deception, and the ruthless pursuit of control. The streets of Chicago were not kind, and he had seen more than his fair share of betrayals, broken promises, and the consequences of misplaced trust. His mother had died before he could even form memories of her, and his father was a ghost that had never once touched his life. Foster homes, shelters, and back alleys had been his upbringing, each one teaching him a new lesson. Never trust too easily, always watch from the shadows, and most of all, know when to speak and when to stay silent. The city had its own rhythm, one that Jamal had memorized like a song stuck on repeat. The shuffle of hurried footsteps, the blaring of distant sirens, the murmured conversations of men who operated outside the law. All of these sounds formed the backdrop of his existence. He had never known the security of a real home, had never once felt the warmth of a family that truly cared. Instead, he had been shuffled from place to place, treated like a number rather than a person. Each foster home had been a new battlefield, each street corner a new test of survival. He had learned to watch people closely, to study the way their eyes flickered with greed, with fear, with hidden motives. It was a skill that had kept him alive, a skill that would soon change everything. By the time he was 16, Jamal had perfected the art of going unnoticed when necessary and being heard when it counted. He had learned the difference between reckless bravery and calculated risk. He had also learned that trust was a currency more valuable than money and far more difficult to come by. He had seen people lie, steal, and betray each other for scraps, for a momentary advantage, for nothing at all. He had vowed never to become one of them. He would survive, but he would not lose himself in the process. He had promised himself that much. That was why, on a particularly cold evening, he found himself weaving through the alleyways behind the Roosevelt Towers, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. The wind cut through the fabric like a blade, but he ignored it, focused instead on the task at hand. He had been doing small-time delivery work for months now, a job that gave him access to places he would never have otherwise seen. Wealthy neighborhoods, corporate offices, even high-end penthouses. No one paid attention to the kid delivering envelopes and packages, and he preferred it that way. But that night was different. That night, he had stumbled into something far bigger than he could have ever anticipated. He had just finished delivering a package to one of the building's upper floors when he heard the voices. They were low, hushed, but urgent. Years of living on the streets had trained his ears to catch tones of danger, and something in those voices made him pause. He wasn't supposed to linger, wasn't supposed to listen, but instinct told him to stop. Pressing himself against the cold marble wall, he strained to hear. The words that reached him made his stomach tighten. It wasn't just idle conversation. It was plotting, scheming, the kind of talk that preceded betrayal. He had heard it before, in different contexts, different settings, but never on this scale. The voices belonged to men who operated in a world far removed from his own, men who wore tailored suits and spoke in measured tones. Yet their intentions were just as ruthless as the criminals he had grown up dodging. His breath slowed as he pieced together what they were saying. They were talking about Christopher Langston, the billionaire who owned this building, the man whose name was on countless properties across the city. The men in the room weren't speaking of business deals or financial reports. They were discussing how to bring him down, how to take everything from him before he even realized it was happening. Jamal remained frozen in place, his heartbeat a steady drum in his ears. He had no allegiance to the billionaire. He had never met him, had never even seen him in person. Yet something about the conversation unsettled him. He had seen people lose everything before. He had seen what betrayal looked like up close. He knew how easily power could be stripped away, how quickly a person could become nothing more than a cautionary tale. He should have walked away. He had no reason to involve himself. It wasn't his fight, but he had spent his whole life watching from the sidelines, and something inside him rebelled at the thought of standing by again. He had never had anyone to protect him, but maybe, just this once, he could stop someone else from being blindsided. Jamal made his choice in that moment. He couldn't walk away. He took a deep breath and slipped out of the hallway, his mind already racing. He didn't know how yet, but he was going to find a way to warn Langston. He had spent his life navigating dangerous situations, but this was something new entirely. This was a game played by the rich and powerful, a game with rules he didn't fully understand. But he had one advantage. He knew how to survive. And if there was one thing Jamal had learned, it was that survival wasn't just about making it through the day. It was about knowing when to act and when to disappear. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in his small apartment, staring out the window, replaying the conversation in his head. He didn't have much, but he had knowledge. And sometimes, knowledge was the most dangerous weapon of all. He had seen enough to know that once a plan was set in motion, there was no stopping it. Unless, of course, someone disrupted it first. He knew what he had to do. Jamal had always been a survivor. But now, for the first time in his life, he was about to become something more. Christopher Langston had built his empire from nothing. From the outside, he was a symbol of power, success, and endless wealth. But behind the towering glass walls of his billion-dollar corporation, he was just an aging man with a target on his back. His own family saw him as nothing more than a golden goose, and now they were ready to make their final move. The city had been his playground, and the business world had been his battlefield. Decades of relentless ambition had carved his name into the highest echelons of corporate power. He had fought, negotiated, and outmaneuvered opponents who had tried to ruin him. He had learned long ago that trust was an illusion, that loyalty was a fleeting concept, and that those closest to him would often be the first to drive a knife into his back. He had seen betrayal in the boardroom, in politics, and in business dealings where fortunes were won and lost with a single signature. But he had never imagined that his greatest threat would come from within his own bloodline. Langston had 3 sons, each of whom had grown up in the shadow of his empire. Randall, the eldest, had always been the most ambitious. From a young age, he had displayed a hunger for power that both impressed and unsettled his father. He had watched his father rise to the top, absorbing every lesson, every maneuver, every ruthless decision. He had always been the one Langston trusted most, but trust had always been a dangerous currency. Now, that trust was about to be broken in the most unforgivable way. Jamal had been working as a part-time courier, delivering packages for a small service that catered to high-profile clients. His job gave him access to places no one questioned, and his silence had earned him trust he never asked for. One evening, he was tasked with delivering a sealed envelope to Langston's estate. But as he moved through the grand hallways, he heard voices, whispers that should never have reached his ears. Randall stood in his father's office, flanked by 2 of his closest allies, executives who had aligned themselves with him in secret. They spoke in low tones, their words thick with intent. They were discussing a plan, one that would strip Langston of his empire before he even realized it was happening. The will was at the heart of it. Randall had arranged for legal paperwork that would transfer control of Langston's wealth, companies, and assets into his own hands. The moment Langston signed, he would be reduced to nothing more than a powerless old man, exiled from the empire he had built with his own hands. Randall's voice carried the weight of certainty, the assurance of a man who believed he had already won. He explained to his accomplices that his father was weak, that the years had softened his grip on power. He spoke of how Langston still believed in family, still clung to the idea that blood was thicker than ambition. Randall had spent years cultivating that illusion, playing the role of the devoted son while secretly orchestrating his father's downfall. He was meticulous, leaving no room for error. The moment Langston's signature graced the will, it would all be over. He would be locked out of his own empire, stripped of authority, and left with nothing. Jamal pressed himself against the cold marble wall, his heartbeat steady as he listened. He had heard of backstabbing before, had witnessed it countless times in the streets, but this was something else. This was not survival. This was calculated destruction. Langston had no idea that the people closest to him were tightening the noose around his neck. They were banking on his blind trust, his belief that his son would protect what they had built together. They had no intention of giving him a chance to fight back. They wanted it done swiftly, surgically, before he could even suspect the betrayal. Jamal knew he had to move quickly. He had seen con games before, had seen men tricked out of everything they owned, But this was a level of deceit he had never encountered firsthand. He couldn't let it happen. Langston was just another rich man, another symbol of power, but even he didn't deserve to be taken down this way. This was not just a financial maneuver. It was the deliberate dismantling of a man's legacy. It was the destruction of everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed for. And it was happening right under his nose. Jamal made a decision. He had no direct path to Langston, no way to reach him without raising suspicion. But he had one advantage. He knew how to make people listen, whether they wanted to or not. He had recorded everything, every whisper, every sinister plan they had laid out the night before. He had the evidence, and now he needed to find a way to deliver it. The next morning, Langston sat in his office, unaware of the storm brewing around him. He had spent his entire life controlling every aspect of his empire, but for the first time, control was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't even know it. The paperwork sat before him, a thick stack of legal jargon that would determine his future. He believed it to be a mere formality, another layer of protection for his legacy. He had no idea that it was a death sentence for everything he had built. Jamal knew he had little time. He couldn't afford to wait, couldn't afford to hesitate. He slipped into the estate under the guise of another delivery, moving with the quiet precision that had kept him alive for years. He had rehearsed what he would say, how he would present the evidence. He had no idea how Langston would react, but he couldn't let that stop him. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about stopping a betrayal before it was too late. Langston looked up as the young man entered, his expression unreadable. Jamal stepped forward, gripping the recording device tightly in his pocket. He had one shot to stop this, one chance to change everything before Langston signed away his empire without realizing he had just sealed his own fate. Jamal had no direct path to Langston. He was a kid from the streets. The billionaire would never believe him. But he had one advantage. He knew how to make people listen, whether they wanted to or not. The next morning, he managed to slip into the billionaire's office under the guise of another delivery. Langston barely looked up, distracted by the mountain of paperwork in front of him. Jamal had only seconds. Langston sat at his vast mahogany desk, the weight of the world pressing onto his aging shoulders. Documents were stacked in neat rows, his reading glasses resting on a contract that could potentially erase everything he had built. The room was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of papers as Langston sifted through them. His attention remained fixed on the legal jargon in front of him, unaware that the fate of his entire empire balanced on a moment he was yet to realize. His trust in his family had blinded him to the danger lurking in their ambitions, and time was running out. Jamal knew hesitation would cost him. He stepped forward with calculated precision, his every move deliberate. He had navigated countless dangerous situations before, but this was different. This was not about survival. This was about altering the course of a man's life. His hands gripped the recording device hidden in his pocket, his pulse steady. He could not afford nerves now. He had spent the previous night replaying every word Randall and his associates had whispered, memorizing their plan, understanding their strategy. The recording had captured the treachery in their voices, their certainty that Langston would never suspect a thing. That certainty was about to be shattered. Langston glanced up briefly, acknowledging Jamal's presence as nothing more than a formality. He was used to couriers coming and going, their deliveries inconsequential to the greater affairs of his empire. Jamal set the package down but did not step away. This was the moment he had been preparing for. He cleared his throat, ensuring his voice remained firm, his words chosen carefully. He had to make Langston listen before it was too late. He could not allow the weight of the billionaire's status to intimidate him. The truth had to be spoken, whether Langston believed it or not. Langston's brow furrowed slightly as he finally took a real look at the boy standing before him. There was something different about this one, something in his stance, in the unwavering way he held himself, in the way he was not in a hurry to leave. Langston studied him with quiet scrutiny, waiting for the interruption that was about to unfold. Jamal met his gaze with the certainty of someone who had already made up his mind. The weight of the conversation had shifted, the silence between them thick with an unspoken tension. Jamal's fingers curled around the device, and without wasting another moment, he pressed play. The voices crackled through the small speaker, flooding the grand office with the evidence Langston had never thought he would need to hear. The whispered conspiracy played out in brutal clarity, every word a dagger cutting into Langston's perception of his own family. The betrayal unfolded before him, undeniable, unfiltered. Randall's voice carried through the room, mapping out the exact plan that would see Langston stripped of everything. Langston listened, his expression unreadable at first. Then, as realization dawned, something in his posture changed. The betrayal of business partners was one thing. He had endured that battle before. But this was his own flesh and blood, scheming behind closed doors, preparing to leave him powerless. His mind reeled through years of moments that suddenly seemed tainted. The carefully crafted trust he had placed in his son shattered under the weight of undeniable proof. He had suspected nothing. He had believed in Randall's loyalty, in the unwavering strength of family. And now, in the span of a single recording, everything he had built stood on the edge of collapse. Jamal stood motionless, watching as the billionaire absorbed the reality of his situation. He knew this was a defining moment. Langston could dismiss him, cast him out as an imposter, refuse to believe the truth before him, or he could take action. Jamal had done his part. He had delivered the warning. What happened next was out of his hands. He had faced the consequences of betrayal before, had seen the destruction it left behind. He had chosen to intervene, but the decision to fight back rested solely in Langston's hands. Langston exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening over the edge of his desk. The storm inside him was visible in the clench of his jaw, the hardening of his gaze. For years he had trusted his son. He had envisioned Randall as the future of his empire. But now he saw the truth. The boy he had raised was not his successor, he was his enemy, and he had nearly succeeded in orchestrating his downfall. Jamal knew he had to say something, had to solidify the moment before doubt could creep in. He spoke with conviction, detailing how he had overheard the plan, how he had realized what was at stake. He told Langston that he had debated walking away, but he could not ignore what he had uncovered. He explained that he had risked everything by coming forward because no one else would. He did not ask for gratitude, nor did he expect it. He was simply delivering the truth. Langston pushed himself up from his chair, his movements slow, deliberate. He had spent decades fighting off competitors who sought to take what he had built. But this betrayal was personal. This was not a battle for contracts or market shares. This was an attack on his very existence, and it would not go unanswered. He fixed his gaze on Jamal, the young man who had saved him from signing away his empire without even realizing it. He understood now that the warning had not come from an outsider with an agenda, but from someone who had witnessed firsthand the depths of human deceit. Jamal remained still, waiting for Langston's reaction. He had played his part, but he knew that the war was just beginning. The will had not yet been signed, but the battle lines had been drawn. Randall had made his move, but now the father he had sought to destroy was no longer blind to the game being played. Langston would not sit idly by while his own blood conspired against him. The betrayal had been exposed. The warning had been delivered. And as Langston reached for his phone, his expression hardened with resolve. The war for his empire had begun. Langston wasn't a man who forgave easily. The moment the recording ended, he made his first move. His legal team was summoned, security was reinforced, and by the time Randall arrived for what he thought would be his moment of triumph, the tide had already turned. Langston sat behind his massive desk, his fingers pressed together as he stared at the door. He had spent his entire life outmaneuvering adversaries, crushing rivals, and securing an empire that had taken decades to build. He had always been prepared for threats from the outside. Competitors had tried to take him down, governments had tried to regulate his power, but he had never once thought that the enemy would come from within his own bloodline. He had played this game for too long to be fooled, but Randall had come dangerously close. The recording still echoed in his ears, the proof of his own son's treachery carved into his mind. He had made the mistake of believing in loyalty, but now he knew better. Randall stepped into the office with his usual confidence, believing that this day marked his victory. He had played his cards perfectly, ensuring that his father would sign the documents without a second thought. He had spent years crafting this moment, slowly planting seeds of trust, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. He had already envisioned his future, already planned how he would reshape the company in his own image. He had spent the night celebrating, drinking to the power that would soon be his. But as he saw his father's expression, something in the air shifted. The cold, unreadable gaze that Langston fixed upon him sent an uneasy feeling creeping down his spine. Something was wrong. Langston lifted the unsigned will from his desk and slowly turned it in his hands. He had seen deception before, but never so close to home. He allowed Randall a few moments of silence, letting the weight of the situation press down on him. Randall was expecting a frail, aging man too blind to see the betrayal unfolding around him. Instead, he was met with the presence of a man who had just been given undeniable proof of his own son's treachery. Langston placed the document back on his desk, his fingers tapping against the surface. He had built his empire with unwavering discipline, and he would not let it be taken from him so easily. Randall opened his mouth, attempting to play the role of the concerned son, but Langston had already decided his fate. He leaned forward, his voice low and measured as he explained what he knew. He laid out every detail of the recorded conversation, repeating the exact words that had sealed Randall's downfall. Every carefully crafted lie, every scheme that had been whispered behind closed doors was now exposed under the harsh light of reality. Randall's face drained of color as realization set in. There was no denying it, no escaping it. The truth had been spoken, and there was no turning back. Langston had spent the night strategizing his next steps. He had already taken action before this meeting even began. His legal team had been working tirelessly, preparing to erase Randall from the company's structure. The security team had been briefed, ensuring that Randall would be escorted out the moment the meeting ended. His financial accounts had already been frozen, his power stripped away before he even realized it was happening. Langston had learned long ago that hesitation was weakness. He would not allow sentiment to cloud his judgment. Randall had chosen his path, and now he would face the consequences. Randall attempted to argue, to manipulate his father one last time, but the words fell flat. Langston was no longer listening. He had seen enough, heard enough, and made his decision. He pressed a button on his desk, signaling the waiting security team. The doors opened, and 2 guards stepped inside, their expressions unreadable. Randall turned, his confidence shattering as he realized what was happening. This was not just a reprimand. This was an exile. Langston was erasing him from the empire he had tried to steal. Randall took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists, but the guards were already moving. They flanked him on either side, ensuring there was no escape. Langston watched in silence as his son was led away, his footsteps heavy with the weight of defeat. There would be no second chances, no forgiveness. Langston had learned his lesson. He had been blind, but never again. Randall had played his hand, and he had lost. Within hours, the news of Randall's removal spread throughout the company. The executives who had aligned themselves with him quickly distanced themselves, scrambling to salvage what little influence they had left. Langston made sure that none of them would remain in positions of power. He dismantled every trace of the conspiracy, ensuring that no one who had turned against him would have a future within his empire. He had built this company with his own hands, and he would not allow it to fall into the grasp of traitors. Jamal watched the events unfold from a distance. He had done what he set out to do. He had warned Langston, exposed the betrayal, and now he saw the consequences play out in real time. He had spent his life watching powerful men destroy each other, but this time, he had been the one to tip the scales. He had expected nothing in return, had asked for nothing. But as he prepared to walk away, something unexpected happened. Langston turned his gaze toward him, recognition in his eyes. For the first time, someone with power had truly seen him. He had been a ghost in the background for so long, moving unnoticed through the world, but now he had made an impact. He had changed the course of fate. Langston extended a hand, not as a businessman offering a deal, but as a man acknowledging a debt. Jamal hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. He had spent his life surviving, but now, for the first time, he had done more than that. He had made a difference. The war for Langston's empire had ended before it had even begun. The betrayal had been crushed, the conspirators removed, and the future secured. Randall had underestimated the father he sought to destroy, but in the end, it had been a boy from the streets who had saved everything. Jamal had walked into that office as an outsider, but now, as he met Langston's gaze, he realized that he was walking away with something far greater than he had ever imagined. Langston had regained control, his empire intact. And Jamal? He had proven that even in a world built on power and deception, one act of courage could change everything.